All right, hello, and good day, students. I'm your course facilitator, Jasmine Mendez, and I'm just going to take a few moments in this presentation to introduce you to the concepts of pre and post assessments. Most of you are probably already doing this in some way, shape, or form, whether formally or informally, and we're just going to talk about the ways in which you can do this a little bit more formally in order to gauge your students' learning progress in your course. So today we're going to take a look at what are pre and post assessments, advantages and disadvantages of these assessments, and strategies for administering the pre and post assessment. So what should you do in the classroom in order to ensure that you've successfully administered and implemented these types of assessments into your course? So what are pre and post assessments? While most of you are more than likely familiar with formative and summative evaluations and assessments for students after they have completed a certain amount of coursework or listened to lecture or done certain activities in your class, some of you may or may not be as familiar with the need to administer pre-assessments before students encounter information, content, and knowledge. So pre and post assessments are specifically designed to be given to students at a specific entry point and exit point. So for example, before you start a unit and then after the unit has ended, or before you start the semester and then at the end of the semester. We often see this with diagnostic exams at the beginning of the school year and then sort of course exit exams at the end of the school year. That's sort of the broad picture, but you can also and should probably do this within units, within larger content objective areas in your course. These assessments can be standardized, used through the department, if you're in a district, throughout the district, throughout the school, or just individualized within your own classroom. And they might also be performance-based. So you might ask students to do something, show that they know or can do a skill at the beginning, then go through the steps, and then ask them to do the same type of skill afterwards, using a rubric. So they don't necessarily just have to be paper and pencil tests. They can be authentic assessments or performance-based. So the pre-post assessment model looks something very similar to this. You start with your pre-assessment, which is usually a formative evaluation, giving students a variety of questions, 10 to 20 questions regarding the objectives and the content that you're hoping to teach them. This will help you gauge kind of where they are with the material. It's a really good informative tool for you as a teacher to know, they're stronger in these skills than they are in others, so now I can design my instruction accordingly. And your instruction can be, as you know, anything from lectures and exercises to assignments, activities, group work, etc. Once you've delivered the instruction based on the information that you learned on the pre-assessment, you will then give the post-assessment, which at this point may or may not be revised based on your knowledge of the pre-assessment and your given instruction. So even though this is a linear diagram, it's more sort of a circular ongoing process whereby you gain feedback and you revise as you go through. The post-assessment being seen as a summative evaluation of everything that they've learned and gained through instruction. But ideally, you're going to create both the pre-assessment and the post-assessment together at the same time with your objectives and your content in mind and aligned with those assessments so you can kind of see where students' growth has been and in what areas. So what are some advantages of doing pre and post assessments in your classroom? They're useful for measuring the value added by a program of study. So if, for example, you're giving or teaching an extracurricular class and you want to see if students actually are gaining more knowledge and more skills in this area, you can show through these assessments how students were when they came into the course and how they are when they left. They serve several purposes. You want to know the current status of a group, where your students are, right, when they first come to class or when you're first starting a unit, so it can guide how deeply you go into your activities or how much background knowledge you need to build for them, or how much content needs to be given before you move to the higher order thinking type skills and activities. It also lets you know, if they are way advanced, and so your lessons might need to be revised because they're not going to have a lot of growth in that area because they already know that information. It's a great basis of comparison for post-test results. So instead of just seeing one data set of, okay, this is how they scored on the information based on on the lessons that I gave, now you have information for what they did and what they knew coming in. So you can look at that and say there was growth in this objective and no growth in that objective. And so you can help compare the two to see ideally and realistically how much your students have grown. And then again, it can let you know if what you think students should know, they do know, or that they don't, that there's going to need to be some more background knowledge built in, some more basic knowledge, those building blocks incorporated into your instruction to get them where you want them to be. What are some disadvantages of pre-post assessments? Well, sometimes it's hard to know if the positive change noted in your data set from pre to post assessments was due to what they learned or natural maturation. In other words, they would have learned it regardless of whether you taught the information or not. As we get into the higher order thinking skills and as we get into the more intense content areas and the higher level content areas, it's more than likely that they won't have learned it simply by maturation, but there are some things maybe that they could have gained just kind of through real world experiences with or without your class, and so sometimes it might be hard to discern if that growth happened specifically because of the lessons you taught. There may often be time problems with statistics. In other words, if the group that came in scored so low that of course they're only going to gain more knowledge and to grow, then you'll probably see some of those inflated scores and data sets and see, wow, there was lots of growth, but having to remember that they came in very low. Or if they scored so high and you still give the same instruction and you don't modify that, and you give the same exact type of lessons that you were going to give anyway, that then in the post-test scores their growth is very minimal because again, they didn't gain a lot of knowledge. You kind of have to be able to analyze the data accordingly and accurately to understand what it means and what it's telling you. And then also, we know that we have this final assessment, so we want to be sure that students will get that information, and so we might teach to the post-test and say, well, these are the kinds of questions, or this is the types of objectives, these are the objectives that I want them to master, so I'm going to teach these objectives. And as good teachers and good educators know, sometimes we have to allow our students to be open to the learning experience and kind of see where the students take us and where they take themselves, and if they want to learn more, if they need to hold back. And so instead of pushing towards just making sure that you teach all of those objectives that are on the test, that the learning does also find a way to happen organically and still reach those goals that you want to reach. So we're not going to get into necessarily creating pre and post assessments here in this video. There will be a later presentation that will discuss that in further detail. But just some things to remember as you administer pre and post tests. Obviously, you always want to decide what you want to measure, so creating a test blueprint, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later in this unit and show you some examples. For those of you that took the Creating Assessments course, a test blueprint is just another word for a table of specifications. So a place where you outline your objectives as well as tell me the types of questions that you want and what level of Bloom's or Mosenthal's taxonomy they're on. Select or develop the assessment tool, so create the pre and post assessments, and as we get into discussing how to do that, you'll learn that they should not be the exact same test administered 2 different times, but rather what you're measuring is the objectives, and so the questions ideally should change, but still measure the same objectives. So that'll be very important as you begin to develop and create your own pre and post tests. Establish a pre and post assessment period. So again, determine what unit or what time frame these assessments are going to cover, and decide that it'll be administered on this Monday, and then after the unit is complete or after the semester is complete, etc. So just have a very clear picture in your mind of when the pre-test will be administered and when the post-test will be administered. You'll also learn later on how to input, analyze, and interpret the data. Online tools are great for this if you are comfortable providing online assessments and quizzes for students, because these programs can do it automatically for you, and that's a great advantage. But if you are still using paper and pencil, and that's totally fine and great, we'll show you ways how to easily input the data to get the information that you want and be able to analyze the data sets. And then you want to be able to use this data to improve and develop your program of study and your course. So again, if you know that students already have that information coming in, how are you going to revise instruction? If you know that students did poorly on the post-test, how are you going to go back and reteach that information? And we'll get into all of these things throughout the next coming weeks, as well as in our one-on-one sessions with the video conferencing. But this is just sort of a short introduction to what are pre and post tests and how they can help you assess student learning progress. For more information on this topic, feel free to read the added article on the course Moodle site labeled Pre and Post Test Introduction. Final assessment checklist. Make sure that the assessment is designed to be and is used as a pre-post test. Verify that the assessment is appropriate for your student skills. Check that the assessment measures what you want it to measure. And try, this is important, to ensure that the conditions under which the student takes the pre and post assessments are as similar as possible. So again, if they're in the classroom or if they're in the computer lab, try to ensure that there are similar settings pre and post test. Thank you for listening, and again, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.